Our next moderator is Kim Livesley. Kim heads the Energy and Resources practice of the Gadens law firm in Australia, which we regard as one of the top law firms overall in Australia and one of the top energy firms. And I'm thrilled to mention that we're in the process of combining with Gadens. Kim is ranked as one of the top energy lawyers in the Australia-Pacific region. He will chair our panel on key trends in Asia and will touch on topics as far-ranging as climate change to energy security. Kim.
Thank you, Clint. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to introduce my panelists this morning. On my right is Shao. Wei is the National Practice Group co-leader for China and specialises in international business transactions focusing on the China region. And he has extensive experience in mergers and acquisitions, cross-border counselling. Interestingly, prior to his legal career, he worked for the United Nations in New York. He's an interpreter accredited by the UN and by the Federal Government of Canada. And as an interpreter or consultant, Wei has been involved in numerous ministerial and prime ministerial meetings or negotiations between Canada and China. To my left, Nancy Sun. Nancy is qualified as a Chinese lawyer. Prior to Dentons China, as it now is called, her firm was Dasheng. And prior to that, she worked as an in-house counsel in a Hong Kong listed company, and also one of Australia's other top law firms, not mine, but another one in both Sydney and in the Shanghai office. And she does a lot of work in the Asia-Pacific region as well and acts for a number of international clients. Does lots of cross-border M&A, joint ventures, setting up new business, capital raisings. So with that, I might just give a quick 2-minute introduction before I pass to our first speaker. The topic, climate change to energy security, Asia, that's a fairly broad topic, isn't it? Asia. Not just one or two countries, it's an interesting mix, arguably stretching from India right through to China, right down to and including Australia. So many of those countries signed up to COP21, so it's going to be quite a challenge in the Asia-Pacific region as to how they're going to meet their undertakings, especially the emerging and frontier economies, and I'm speaking here of Indonesia, Vietnam, Myanmar. These countries have a dependence on fossil fuels, and that remains, and of course the challenge is to transition from this emission-intensive generation to renewables. At the moment, one of the big factors is that new 4-letter word coal, which everybody hates. Some areas, such as Myanmar and even India, are actually looking at increasing their coal-fired generation. So, excuse me, it's going to be an interesting time. I think we can see in the region that gas and possibly batteries is the balancing fuel from the dependence on coal through to renewables. I hesitate to say this, bearing in mind our earlier speaker who talked about forecasters, but it is said that outside the US, it's anticipated that renewables will overtake gas as the global generation source by 2027 and will overtake coal by 2037. I say that in light of his comments that who knows whether a forecaster is right. The interesting thing, to give you an example of the security issues that rise, I only have to look into my backyard in the state of South Australia, excuse me, which is in the bottom part of Australia. 41% of their generation at the moment is by renewables, so that's wind or solar, which is extraordinary. Earlier this year, and in addition to that, so what they've done is they've closed down all their coal power stations. So it was a very hot summer, and they had an enormous amount of need for power, for electricity. Well, as you will know, it's an intermittent energy source, renewables at the moment. So they ended up paying an absolute fortune from their estate next door, Victoria, to get onto the grid to get power from another state. So it's an interesting analysis of going too far, too quick, sometimes with renewables. So you have to be careful. And the concept of closing down all your gas-fired and coal-fired power stations and relying upon renewables is something to be careful about. Obviously, the need in the region is a need for policy, consistent policy, not just in China or Australia, but right through the area, through Myanmar, through India. These countries, the concept of bilateral and preferential trade agreements is a tool that can be used to have a consistent policy in the region to assist. I can't talk. In Australia, we've had 5 prime ministers in 5 years, and only 3 of them were elected. So our policy on renewables it changes every year. So it's a problem in itself. I think with that, Wei, can I introduce you to have a chat about what you see as how you see it from a Canadian point of view in terms of how China is operating?
Sure. I guess my perspective will be sort of a triangular between among China, Canada, and U.S. You mentioned that in Australia, energy policies change every 5 years. I guess looking back...
Every 1 year.
Every 1 year, okay. This morning, of course, we talked about trends. To me, trends or momentum or 5 or 6 year thing, if you look at the Chinese investment into Canadian energy space in the last little while. But we also heard this morning the term of U.S. being the energy superpower. I guess years before the rise of U.S. As energy superpower, we heard a term of Canada being an energy superpower. At least that's what the Canadian Prime Minister, former Canadian Prime Minister Harper said, among other things, to his Chinese audience. This was back in 2012, when I was also doubling as an interpreter for the Prime Minister's office. I recall the Prime Minister spoke to a room full of senior executives from Chinese energy industry and said Canada would become the next energy superpower. Indeed, months after his meetings in Beijing with Chinese oil and gas energy executives, the Chinese company CNOOC concluded the next acquisition, by far the biggest acquisition or Chinese investment in a foreign country up to 2012. But looking back in the history of Chinese investment into Canada, it's kind of interesting. So what I would like to do in the next 5 minutes is to give a very quick overview of where things stand in terms of a Chinese investment into or through Canada. If you look at the movement of Chinese money into Canada, this really started in 2005 when CNOOC made its first investment into the Canadian oil sands industry. It is interesting in the sense that only 2 or 3 years before that investment, in the Chinese National Energy and Mineral Security discussion paper, Canada was not even featured as part of Chinese energy supply sources. But then again, 2005 started a steady flow of Chinese investment. We see the 3 major Chinese oil and gas companies, CNOOC, PetroChina, and CNPC, and Sinopec, each has made significant investment. It's sort of a 3+1 in the sense that the China Investment Corporation became the 4th major player in the Canadian energy space. By 2012, several things happened. First of all, the former Prime Minister of Canada took over a dozen of senior executives from major Canadian energy companies to China. That year also saw the completion of an economic complementarity study between the Chinese Ministry of Commerce and Canadian Department of International Trade, which listed 7 areas as the potential areas for the bilateral cooperation between the two countries, energy featuring #1 among the list. However, if you look at the where things stand today, then after 2012, after the completion of Nexen acquisition, there's a major slowdown of the Chinese money moving into Canada. That's partially because of the slowdown of the Chinese economy, also, of course, the drop in oil prices. So we don't see the 3 major players anymore. Not only that, China Investment Corporation has shut down its office in Toronto. It's probably moving that office to New York, but they haven't apparently made that move yet. If you look at the players of the Chinese oil and gas companies in Canada, we don't find what they call the central government controlled SOEs anymore. The CSOEs are no longer active in Canada. In their place, we see smaller provincial SOEs, such as Hubei Energy, Hebei Energy, or Beijing Energy, or to a lesser extent, some smaller gas and oil companies. We see, however, new players coming into the scene, Chinese insurance companies, investment funds, and private companies. We also see, of course, deals going through Canada. Dentons, for instance, is involved in 2 major transactions through Canada. One was the acquisition of the US company, Woodbine Acquisitions, LLC, which was acquired by Shanghai-listed Meidu, first by a Chinese company in acquiring US producing energy assets. The second, of course, was a recent acquisition by Hong Kong-listed Geojade of the Canadian company Bankers Petroleum, which had oil assets in Albania. So deals through Canada have become a trend, more so in the mineral sector than in oil and gas sector, but we do see the change. Dentons, of course, fortunately acted for both those transactions. We also see the Chinese policy banks, China Development Bank and Exim Bank, beginning to be active in Canada. In particular, Exim Bank, which has formulated several funds, including one targeting investment in energy and minerals in North America. We know that some other funds are being formulated with the mandate of investing in energy as the target. Now, the Chinese interest in the Canadian energy is of a broad range. And they cover not only the conventional gas, oil and gas, but also oil sands, even though, as I mentioned, there's a slowdown in investment in oil sands for various reasons. There's also interest in LNG. If you look at the 15 listed LNG projects in Canada, all the 3 major Chinese oil and gas companies are involved, including one sponsored by Nexen. The other one are sort of a participating interest by 2 other major Chinese oil and gas companies. They also are involved in 2 smaller LNG projects. There's also a recent interest from China in uranium. partly because they know that in oil and gas projects, they cannot move too fast because of the constraints. Constraints I mentioned briefly. There's also interest from Chinese EPC and construction companies in getting involved in pipelines, in rails, in other utilities projects in China, in Canada. From the Chinese perspective, one thing that stands out, that is, if you look at the investment, almost $40 billion in total now, there's very limited success story for various reasons. Complaints from China are that there were three major hurdles in Canada. One is the regulatory delay. The other is, of course, lack of infrastructure. And third, perhaps most importantly, the social license or the First Nations issue, inability of the Canadian partners to secure approval or consent from the First Nations. Because of these, a recent internal report from China's development shows that of the 14 major projects China development has financed in Canada, many of which are natural resources related, 13 they have not seen any cash flow yet. So China development is sitting on an interesting dilemma. On the one hand, it has demanded to loan more, but at the same time, the 13 files they've been involved in Canada, there's no success to report to the regulators yet. So that's where things stand as far as the Chinese investment in Canada is concerned. Now, looking internally within China as to why there's a major slowdown of money inflow into Canada, of course, everybody is talking about the anti-corruption campaign and how that has impacted on the decision-making and the morale of decision makers at major SOEs. It is an issue, but it is also an issue of the Chinese taking a second look at their investment, at their so-called Going Global campaign, which was started in 2001. I guess that's what I've had for the time being. I'll leave my friend Nancy talking about renewables, which are not part of Chinese investment in Canada.
Very good. Thank you very much, Wei.
Thank you, Kim and Wei. I do have slides. And actually, I found quite interesting. I have a similar observation as Wei's, but from my part of the world in China. So my topic is China energy transition and historic chance. So we all understand that we are experiencing difficulty at the moment. China is not an exception. So under the global climate of economic downturn, China's economic growth has also slowed down under the pressure. As you can see from the chart on the left, the green bar shows that the GDP growth decreased from 9.5% in 2011 down to 6.9% in 2015, the lowest in the last 5 years. However, in contrast, the China outbound investment has never slowed down. The momentum remains. The value of the China outbound investment grows 6 times within the decade, all the way up, as you can see on the chart on the right. And the yellow bar in 2014 shows that China's outbound investment grew by 13.3 in 2015, hitting a historical high at $139.5 billion. And This chart shows the investment trends from 2011 to 2015. As you can see, 2013 is a turning point. Before that, the energy and mining sectors accounted for around half of China outbound M&A. However, this proportion has dropped to less than 11% in the last 2 years. And the investment in TMT, auto, transport, medical, power utilities, consumer products increased dramatically. I think that's explained why, from a waste perspective in Canada, they see less and less energy investment from China into Canada. However, in contrast to 2014, we saw less mega transaction in the energy and resources sector in 2015. The volume of mid-sized transactions with a value between 100 million to 500 million US dollar has increased the most. So those transactions mainly invested by like a private fund and private-owned enterprises rather than the really big energy companies such like Sinopec, CNPC, and those companies. Well, I think this is a really big question. But I try my best to explain a little bit. I think for the Chinese government, renewable energy, indeed, the government has made a lot of effort and invest a lot of fund into this area. But on the other side, Chinese government, to protect the environment, also make a lot of effort to try to shut down the coal-fired power plants. So there are a lot of actions on the working list for the government right now. How to make it more efficient? I think this is really big topic and a lot of work to do. And the complexity of this work is China is such a large country. It's not even though the central government make some policy or decision, but at the provincial level, because the economy development is so imbalanced, and also the provincial government have their own economic development need. So sometimes it's really hard to kind of implement such policy equally across China. But we do see a lot of effort, and including the carbon trading market setup is also an incentive by the government to try to make the company themselves, rather than the government using the policy to push forward, to just give the companies more incentive to reduce the carbon emission, to use more renewable energy rather than conventional energy. So we see there are a lot of efforts and there are a lot of actions right now, but I think it's definitely takes some time.
If I can add just a few quick remarks. The talk in town in Beijing is the reform, the demand side reform, and included in that is the potential restructuring of the whole energy and power generation system. There's a talk as to whether there will be more combinations or mergers among some of the leading energy companies in China. For instance, whether the three major Chinese oil and gas companies, whether they will stay as the top three or whether there will be a combination. Also, there is talk of allowing more private companies to get involved into the supply side of the whole energy system. So a lot of things are happening, and all this against the background of this anti-corruption campaign. So things in the next 6 months to 12 months will be very interesting in China in the energy space.
You mentioned, Nancy, the carbon trading. It reminded me, one of our Prime Ministers tried to bring in a carbon trading regime a few years ago. His name was Mr. Rudd. He was actually proficient in Mandarin. You probably would have remembered him. That was about the only thing he was proficient in, actually. But he tried to bring in a trading scheme, and the opposition, the Liberals or the Tories or the Republicans, as you'd call them, they just branded it as a tax, and of course he lost the election immediately. So it goes back to our earlier comment this morning. So it's a challenge, this trading scheme concept, and it's not everybody's wish or desire to have it. It's complex, so it's interesting that it's in. The other comment I'd make is that forever there will be a need for steel making in China. There will also be a need for metallurgical coal. So there will always, that will not go away, I suspect, for some time. And I'm just wondering, is there a carbon storage and capture type facilities in China? Is that something that, from a technology point of view, that's being pursued?
Yes, definitely. And for the CCS technology, the government, currently there is a technology catalog, and the government tried to include more advanced technology, including CCS technology, into that catalog and then promote nationwide in China. And CCS definitely is one of the technology, just now I mentioned on my slides. Because by 2030, no coal-fired power plant without CCS are allowed by the government. So the CCS technology is definitely very important. And it's just happened. So we see a lot of Chinese companies, they try to acquire company with such technology or directly buying that technology, because there are huge market in China. And the other topic that you mentioned about the China carbon trading market is a cap and trade scheme. It is very similar to the California carbon market. Surprisingly, I found when I was in San Diego in March this year. But indeed, there are a lot of challenges because at the moment, even for the 7 pilot carbon market, the regime, the trading regime and the threshold for including the companies, controlled companies are totally different among 7 pilot markets. Because again, the economy development is so imbalanced. So it tried to meet the specific requirements locally. But when people talk about the nationwide carbon market next year, lots of questions, such as what kind of a market it will be. It is built up on top of the 7 pilot market, or it is a whole new market. And even think about it is a kind of a national trading regime, or it is a physical trading exchange, whatever. There are a lot of questions. And last time I think when I talked to the NDRC, the national NDRC, the government official, they are working on this regime. When I asked these questions, they said it's very likely to on the existing 7 pilot regional market, but on top of that, there is going to have the national regime rather than a physical national exchange, so that companies from different provinces, they can trade according to that national regime. But still, there are many questions, such like what kind of a company can be concluded as eligible participants in that market, and also what specific trading rules it will be, and what kind of penalty if the company do not comply with the carbon emission control obligations. So there are a lot of uncertainties, but there are also a lot of opportunities at the moment, because we see a lot of companies, they proactively approach NDRC, both national level NDRC and provincial level NDRC, to try to build up the good relationships, to convince and to build up the future linkage with the market.
Okay, very good.
If I can add, China is not Canada is not yet part of that corporate discussions yet, as far as Canada is concerned. But to come back to your comment about steel making and metallurgical coal, in many ways Canada is similar to Australia. So those coking coal companies, iron ore companies, they were quite nervous, waiting to see exactly what's going to happen in China and when sort of a normalcy can be restored there. At the meantime, they are struggling to find ways to deal with, to cope with the challenges. One company has created an Australian solution. A Canadian iron ore company is starting to sell Australian eggs to the Chinese, so turn into a mining company into a dining company in the process.
The Canadians always follow the Australians. It's nothing unusual. All right. Well, look, we must call it time now, unfortunately. I'd like to thank you both, Nancy and Wei, very much. Thank you.